Plant spacing is imperative to a healthy, productive garden. But as one of the fundamentals of planting, it's often overlooked and it's often an afterthought until it's too late. As spring garden fever hits us, there's a double whammy working against us for proper plant spacing. So let's look at the two main causes of improper plant spacing. As well, let's look at the three main factors that govern how much space a plant actually needs. The biggest mistake people make when spacing out their plants happens in the spring, during that first planting. Plants, just like people, start out small and innocent. They are so cute and inconspicuous, we want to jam in as many as possible. Well, these tiny seedlings obviously don't stay tiny. With the increase of warmth and light that comes with summer, most of our vegetable crops will explode. And with that, spacing deficiencies become exposed. Whether it's a vine grower like peas or indeterminate tomatoes, or even a ground cover like strawberries, you gotta keep the eventual size of the plant in mind. The second mistake that we gardeners make happens with our seeding. Commonly, in direct sowing, more seed is laid down than is actually necessary. This is because it's infinitely easier to thin out our crops as they grow, as opposed to resowing it in the empty spots later. Don't be afraid to throw down that seed. It's cheap, and most crops are a cinch to thin, even those container crops like annual herbs. In the case of our strawberries here, they're quite shallow rooted. So for growing them, we're actually able to get away with a small 4-inch deep herb planter. However, as a spreading crawling plant, they're only going to last a couple of seasons in this setup before the mother crowns start to outcompete themselves. Now that we know the mistakes to look out for both when planting plants and direct seeding, let's look at the factors that govern plant spacing. The first factor to be cognizant of is a plant's growth habit. Meaning, is it a vine? Is it a bush? Does it spread out when it gets older? Can you train it vertically to foster higher concentration of plants? These are all things to consider when spacing out your rows or raised beds. The second factor governing plant spacing is pollination. Does the plant need other plants to actually produce the crop? Such is the case as our corn here. Corn requires a certain number of other corn plants to carry out the pollination of the ears. So not only do corn plants need other corn plants nearby, they also need a minimum number of stalks in the area to produce proper pollination. On the flip side of corn are plants like peppers. If you are growing specific varieties of peppers, be aware that they will cross-pollinate and possibly contaminate your strains. When you grow heirloom or heritage varieties, this is always a concern. The final factor governing our plant spacing is the actual size of the plant, both above the ground and below. Often, this can even override factor number 1, where we're trying to use growth habit and orientation to our advantage. If a plant grows huge or has a large hungry root system, there's nothing we can do about it. It just needs space. You can get cheeky and shoehorn in plants with staggering growth habits, but don't push it beyond reason. Pruning, soil amendments, and a little extra care here and there can allow us to concentrate larger plants somewhat, but there are limits. Big plants often produce big results, so give them the room that they need, as these crops are almost always worth it. This goes for container plants as well, with one plant per pot always being advisable. Now that we know the mistakes to avoid, as well as the factors that govern our success, let's look at a few planting examples to see how the theoretical plays out. In our first example, you can see here where I'm planting out a new bed, actually 2 new beds, of peppers. These are nice, well-established starter plants that are about 2 months old. Pepper plants get huge, and they get massive, always hungry root systems. As such, they need a minimum spacing of 18 to 24 inches between not only the next pepper plant, but also any other plant with the same growth habit. Next up, we have zucchinis. Also known as summer squash, these guys get huge foliage, as you well know. But they're relatively shallow rooted, and they also grow in a direction. We can use this to our advantage. We can stagger the plants in a zigzag pattern and literally point the growth in any direction we want. Again, know the plant's growth habit beforehand. It's beneficial beyond belief. Lastly, let's clean up these 2 disaster beds that have sat dormant for 2 years. Overgrown with weeds and impossible looking is our specialty here. Let's watch as we make short work of the cleanup and prep the bed for a semi-no-till, no-dig multi-crop planting. With our beds clear, I'm going to plant the back first. In this bed, we're going to have a trellis row of climbing cucumbers in the back with a front row of determinate bush cherry tomatoes. I tend to give my cucumbers about 18 to 24 inches of space in between each plant, even though they are a vertical grower. As you go through a few seasons of planting and growing, you start to get a feel for the ideal space of each crop, regardless of what the package on the seed says. Every soil and climate grows each variety of plant differently, so don't expect to master plant spacing in your first year. Honestly, it's the one gardening discipline that you'll learn over a lifetime. Time for the front row. Instead of planting right in line with the cucumbers, let's stagger these bush tomatoes in between the gaps, allowing for more room to grow. I gotta say, it does feel weird to actually be digging holes in the garden, as I normally don't, but I really want to get these plants in deep to activate their stems into growing killer root systems right off the bat. With the first bed all planted, you can really see that perfect zigzag pattern that we used. Let's get started on the next bed. In this one, we're going to space some ultra tall vine tomatoes along the back to take advantage of that wire trellis. These guys are lanky buggers, and the deeper we can get them, the better. As you can see, I'm removing quite a few of the bottom leaf nodes. Don't worry, the tomatoes can take it. Planting tomatoes like these ones deep is not optional. We'll just work our way through the back of the bed, giving these indeterminate tomatoes about 2 feet between each plant. Easy stuff. Planting starters that are already 2 feet tall is like giving yourself an instant garden. And if you germinated the plants from the beginning, it can't really be considered cheating. Before doing any more work in this bed, I'm going to go ahead and tie off those tomatoes right now. No need to inadvertently break one in half at this point. That would be beyond frustrating. With the back of the bed all planted out, let's start on the front. We're going to complement those vine tomatoes with a nice row of zucchinis. Zucchinis are an insanely large plant. However, like we mentioned before, they do grow in a direction. We can plant them at the edge of the bed, pointed outwards. There'll be more than enough room for both crops to coexist this way. I germinated these zucchinis back in February, and it's nice to finally get them in the ground. The zucchini go really fast, as they don't need to be planted nearly as deep as the tomatoes or cucumbers. Even though the plants will eventually fill out this bed, it's imperative for the health of the soil to cover any exposed parts. This will aid in both weed control and moisture retention, as well as keep that active layer of soil near the surface, where it should be. I first cover the exposed dirt with a few layers of newspaper to act as a weed barrier. The weeds are really kept in check by applying this layer, which is saying something, considering the state of the beds beforehand. Next up, we need an actual mulch. Today, we're going to use coarse straw. I like to lay my mulches on nice and thick, at least 2 inches. Obviously, you don't want to bury your plants, but the thicker a mulch becomes, the more it can do for your garden. As the season goes on and the newspaper breaks down, as well as any of that straw that's touching the surface, that mulch becomes part of the soil profile. Amazing the way nature recycles. Finally, we give that bed a good soaking and take satisfaction in knowing that we have a perfectly spaced bed, ready to excel this summer. Other than maybe soil quality and climate, plant spacing can have the biggest impact on your crop success. The 2 biggest mistakes that we can make early in the season are planting to the current size of the plant rather than the eventual size, resulting in overcrowding. And then seeding our rows either too heavy and not thinning, or too light and just wasting space. If you can observe the growth habit and orientation, the pollination requirements, and the adult size of your plant, both below and above the ground, you will give your garden the best chance at reaching its full potential this summer. Hey, thanks for watching, guys. If you're getting value in this and the other series that I'm doing on YouTube, hit those like, share, and subscribe buttons if you'd be so kind, and I'll see you in the next video.